Hi, I am Ganel-Lyn, and I wanted to share some thoughts with you tonight about the temple. I'm in one of my sacred grove spaces in my room. I invite you to find your own sacred grove, your place that you can go to meditate, to study, to pray, and to learn and wrestle with questions and doubts and fears. I think a lot about Joseph Smith at 14, who was struggling to know if his teenage self was in line with God, and he went to a grove of trees that then became the sacred grove because of what he experienced there. And this is one of my places in my room. Right behind me is a painting of the Portland Temple. That's the temple that I was sealed into my husband 27 years ago. And that day was a very, very special day. But I want to go backwards to way before that. I grew up in California, where the closest temple was quite a few hours away in Oakland. I grew up north of California, north of Sacramento. And it was a place that from a very young age, the first time I was able to go, and we'd only be able to go to baptisms once a year on temple trips. And we would get these little cards afterwards saying how many names we had done baptisms for. And I remember as a young teenage girl, sitting in the chapel waiting to do baptisms and feeling a spirit there that was not like any other place that I had been. And I remember going through my high school years and struggling with maybe some of the things that you struggle with, and feeling like I had made mistakes and struggled with issues that were happening in my family and in my own doubts and insecurities and heart. And then I remember going away to college and knowing very clearly that I wanted the next steps in the temple, which would be the endowment and hopefully a sealing. And fast forward now, 27 years later, I was able to receive the endowment in the Oakland Temple, where I grew up going and doing baptisms. And then a few weeks later, I was sealed in the Portland Temple. And I will tell you, there is no place on earth like the temple. The covenants and ordinances that are done there, the covenants that we make, literally bind us to God. And there's so much in the world that distracts, that says, this is the party, this is the fun place, this is where you should be, this is where you will be accepted, this is where the cool people go hang out, this is what you should be working towards. And then there's a lot in the world telling us that we should be making choices based on what we want, what feels good, and whatever's in front of us at the time. So much about the temple is about patience. So much about the temple is about waiting. And so much about the temple is about living covenants and keeping commandments and being obedient. I've come to know that through obedience, God's love and His Spirit can be increased in our lives. I like to say that even if you're not following the commandments, and none of us are doing that perfectly, that oftentimes I make the comparison. If you talk to a drug addict, does Heavenly Father love that drug addict just as much as He loves someone that isn't addicted to drugs? And the answer is yes. But the drug addict himself or herself feels the drug more than they feel the love of God. And that's an extreme example for all of us, that oftentimes we allow things between us and God. And His love for us doesn't change even if we're not being obedient. But the obedience that we exercise allow an increase of power in our lives. And the temple requires some standards, some boundaries. I love that every temple is different. Every temple on the earth is different. The temple I attend now is the Mount Timpanogos Temple. It's very similar to the Bountiful Temple. And yet there's just a few differences that when I first started attending the Timpanogos temple, I would get confused where to walk and where to go because I was so used to my weekly visits to the Bountiful temple. But it's a reminder to me that Heavenly Father finds beauty in our diversity, that we all on the outside and on the inside can be different. And yet the ordinances and covenants are the same. So often in the church, we make each other feel as if there's some kind of mold, that if you are an active member of the church, this is how you look, how you dress, how you vote, how you act. But what I've come to see is that God calls leaders that are diverse. He has temples that represent Him that are diverse and different. And yet the core covenants and ordinances that we do are the things that are the same. And so I hope that if you're feeling like maybe you don't have a place and that you don't fit a mold, that you will realize that the Lord loves your diversity and your unique beauty and your contribution. But the gospel is a unifying factor. Everything we do in the temple is leading us back to God and helping point back to Him. And our covenants allow that power to bind us to Him, like a binding that cannot be severed. Covenants are promises that God always keeps. I know during various times of my life, going to the temple felt differently. When I was younger, some of the turmoil that I was experiencing in my life, I would feel that melt away when I was in the temple for those yearly visits. And as I got married and we struggled to have children, I remember going to the temple praying fervently to become a mom because my patriarchal blessing said I would be a mom, and it hadn't happened yet. The San Diego temple is a special place for me because I prayed for my son in pretty much every corner of that temple while I worked there. And then fast forward, we had our family, our 2 children, and then things became challenging as our children grew older and we were parenting teenagers. It became more difficult. And I remember I would walk into the temple with heavy heart and a list of things that were my worry and my fears and my concerns. And I remember one day as I walked into the temple, I was so worried about my oldest child. And I remember doing the ordinances that day and feeling like nothing had changed. And I really just kind of cried and felt a heavy heart. But I had learned that if I show up each week, or as often as possible, that I was changed even if the situation in my life didn't change. And that day I walked out and there was a green sticky note on my car window and it said, "You are loved." Well, that green sticky note has stayed in my study journal every year when I start a new study journal, because that day in the temple I hadn't seen anyone that I knew. And in the parking lot, no other cars had that green sticky note. So I felt like it was a direct message from my Heavenly Father via someone else that had a prompting to leave me that note. So sometimes now I will keep sticky notes in my car and I will just randomly go into parking lots and leave "You are loved" notes on people's cars. But that reminds me of often when I see it, when I study my scriptures each day, that Heavenly Father is mindful of me, and that even if the stressors and the struggles in my life don't get resolved as quickly as I would like, that He is there and He's aware of me. Fast forward a few years ago, my 40-year-old sister took her life. And I talk pretty openly and often about suicide and preventing suicide. And I remember about 24 hours after we had found her, I was busy planning the funeral and writing the obituary, and I hadn't slept, and I was preparing to fly to California to do the funeral and take care of her remains and take care of her home and things. And I was tired, but I knew I needed the temple. And I remember literally feeling like I crawled into the temple that night. And as I sat through the endowment session, I could feel the ministering that comes only from being in that place. And as I left the temple that night, the grief really hadn't changed. And I didn't feel all of a sudden fine that my sister was gone. But I knew that the habit and the commitment I had made to regular temple attendance is what was going to help me through the grief. I think so oftentimes in our world we do things based on what feels good or what we want. And a lot of the time you may go to the temple and you might feel like it's kind of flat. I'm not feeling any new experiences. I'm not seeing any angels. I'm not having any big answers to my prayers. I invite you to continue to show up, to keep going, because it is in that commitment to showing up that the Lord can tutor us, bless us, inspire us, comfort us, and strengthen us. And that even if you don't feel different, each time you go in and participate in ordinances, especially for those that you have done for those that have passed on, you are changed and you are acting as a savior for those that have passed on. You're doing work for people that can't do it for themselves. And there's nothing more Christ-like than doing that. President Hinckley, don't you just love President Hinckley? He said this, "I know your lives are busy. I know that you have much to do. But I make you a promise that if you will go to the house of the Lord, you will be blessed and life will be better for you." I offer that same promise to you. As President Hinckley has said, my life is better because of the temple. The decisions that I have made, the ordinances that are done there, and the covenants that I have made and choose to keep when I leave, because that's the truth, right? We go to the temple, but we come home to keep those covenants. And as I've made decisions in my life to make sure I'm in possession of a current temple recommend, my life has been blessed. And I promise as the world continues to get crazy, the temple can and will be a beautiful place of rest and revelation if you make the decision to always stay worthy of that recommend. I promise you that the world is busy and flashy and loud, but that the ordinances and covenants that we make in the temple are more powerful than any weapon, more powerful than any force in the world, in the universe, and that God can meet you there, right where you're at. You will find, if you keep returning, that it's a place of learning. And I love that those that I admire and respect choose to go there to keep being tutored. And sometimes it feels like, especially, that you're doing the same ordinances over and over again, and it can feel sometimes like you're not progressing and you're not learning anything new. And I invite you to just ask that the Lord opens your mind and heart, and that you ask and take questions when you go to the temple, because I promise you that angels are there and that they will come home with you. There is great power that you bring home, and that second to the temple should be our homes as sacred places on earth. And so I invite you not only to make sure that you're attending the temple, but to also create a space in your home, in your room, where you can commune with God, where you can re-center each day, each morning and night, and that you can wrestle with your questions and doubts, because the Lord is fine with that. He welcomes your questions and he welcomes your doubt. He wants to meet you in those scriptures, and he wants to meet you in your prayer, and he wants to meet you in the temple. If you aren't currently holding a temple recommend, I invite you to do all that you can to have one, and to visit temple grounds if you're nearby them. Take a journal weekly, and write and reflect on the sacred grounds, the beautiful temple grounds. And I'm so grateful that I live in a time where temples dot the earth. And I'm grateful for the power that has given me to do the hard things in life. And I hope that this message will inspire you to find more power and commitment and frequency in visiting the temples and participating in the work that is unique there. And I send this message out with love and an invitation to all that hear it to come to the temple. Thank you.